What's really behind why beef on dairy calves struggle to thrive once they hit the feedlot? Well, Dr. Stephanie Hansen from Iowa State University joins us here on the Uplevel Dairy Podcast. We sat down with her at the Adisseo VIP seminar where she shared her latest research on mineral nutrition and inflammation in dairy crossed calves. She unpacks what we're learning about copper toxicity, immune response, and how dairy producers can play a bigger role in setting these calves up for long-term success. That and more right here today on the Uplevel Dairy Podcast. This episode is sponsored by Uplevel Dairy Podcast founding partner Adisseo, a global leader in nutritional solutions and premier provider of rumen-protected methionine for dairy producers who want to optimize milk production, capture more value from components, and maintain the health of their high-performing herds. Feed is the greatest expense on any dairy operation, and don't you want to know how an adjustment to the ration will affect your bottom line? Adisseo empowers nutritionists to make informed ration balancing decisions with MilkPay.com. Customizable to your dairy's own data, this profitability calculator puts the power of real-time milk market information in the palm of your hand. Find out how much your latest ration change is really costing you with the free MilkPay app available on iOS and through MilkPay.com. Well, Dr. Stephanie Hansen from Iowa State University, welcome to the Uplevel Dairy Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
And you were just on the stage here at Adisseo's VIP seminar, and you were talking about something that is on the minds of so many dairy producers, nutritionists, and those that are working with cattle through our dairy side of the business. But truly, your background is in the beef side. So would you just take a minute and tell me a little bit about what you are doing at Iowa State and your beef background? And then we'll blend that into why you are visiting us in the dairy conversation today.
Absolutely. Well, I always tell people I'm a mineral nerd. That's my handle on Instagram. So I am probably doing more thinking on a daily basis about minerals than anybody in the industry. People tell me that's probably the case. So I'm a feedlot nutritionist. So most of my work has been around especially the stressors that animals experience in the feedlot. So we're interested in how they deal with trucking, how they deal with disease challenges, and then ultimately how we can make sure that they grow and perform for our producers. So at the end of the day, I'm trying to figure out what all that small stuff that we cram into our ration, like the minerals and vitamins, is actually doing for our animal.
And you have recently become the new contact person for folks that have questions about these beef on dairy calves. So tell me about that segue of your own career from being solely focused as the mineral nerd on the beef side to now extending your knowledge and your skill set into the dairy farming business.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is twofold. One of them is when Bill Weiss from the Ohio State University retired a few years ago. They didn't have kind of an heir apparent on who was coming into mineral expertise. And so I started getting more calls on the dairy side. But really where it started was getting emails and stuff from different vets and helping different feedlot folks deal with the fact that they would have calves coming in the fall when the new calf run comes in, and we've got beef on dairy calves as a part of that. And they just didn't seem to be doing very well in the feedlot. So the question would be something like, Dr. Hansen, we've got, this animal, this type. We posted some that died, so we're trying to look and see. And we thought maybe you could look at the mineral results and see if anything jumps out to you. And the first thing that jumps out to me is, why do they have such high liver copper? Because this is a very, very high rate of liver copper.
So you now have become the go-to person for these questions. And really the big question that we're going to be digging into today is what you just stated. Why are these beef on dairy calves not thriving when they get to the feed yard? And one of the areas, as you mentioned, that you've uncovered is this extremely high levels of copper. So let's break that out. Can you share some examples from your research and your work that look at copper supplementation on the beef side, but then also we'll parlay that into how that's different when our calves are coming from dairy sources. So what are you seeing first off on the beef side with copper and how that plays out in the young calf diet?
So I think one of the things to remember is that with a beef animal or a beef on dairy animal or a dairy animal, we are talking about an animal who has a relatively low rate of copper absorption when they're a mature ruminant. And that oftentimes on the straight beef side and the native beef calves, as we call them, coming in, a straight Angus, for example, we might actually have a calf who could be pretty copper deficient. We actually have a lot of forages that are relatively low in copper across the United States. So if animals haven't had a good supplemental mineral program, they could actually be copper deficient. Because of that, and avoiding the risk of having an animal have copper deficiency, because that's bad for immune function, it's bad for growth. We don't want any of those things. Nutritionists in the feedlot have really said, well, we're just going to feed a little more of things like copper in the ration when the calf first comes to the feedlot because we don't want him to be deficient. So let's just fortify, we'll put more copper in the diet. So maybe he requires 10 parts per million, but we'll just put 15 or 20 in there. He's not eating very much for feed. We'll just really concentrate it. So every mouthful is this like little pack full of nutrition like copper. And so while that might be okay on my straight Angus calf who may have come in with a mild copper deficiency, it looked totally different when we started to dig into it on the beef on dairy side.
Okay, so let's talk about that. So you just laid out the foundation for this challenge with beef calves, native beef calves, of sometimes having that lower copper level and kind of a compensation from the nutrition side to say, well, let's make up for that before it's a problem. Beef on dairy calves coming from dairy sources. You saw something else when you started looking at the profile of their mineral supplementation and levels as they were coming into the feedlots, didn't you?
Absolutely. So when we started to see some of those necropsy results from the vets who were trying to troubleshoot, right? That's why they're calling me to try to help figure out what the answer to the mystery is. And I was like, okay, why is liver copper so high? It's 800 parts per million. It's 900 parts per million. That's very high. It's above our toxic thresholds. And so I started backtracking, right? So this animal is 400 pounds when he comes into the feedlot. He had high liver copper. He, didn't survive for whatever reason. Let's go back. Where did he come from? He came from the calf ranch. So what did he get when he was at the calf ranch? What did he get during pre-weaning? And as we started to get closer and closer back to when he was actually born, is kind of when we started to think, I think we've maybe figured out where some of this problem is starting.
And so elaborate on that.
Okay, so when a calf is born, he's actually born with really high liver copper. And that is because during gestation, whatever copper we're feeding to the cow, she actually gives a good portion of that to the baby via the placenta. And that's a totally normal thing to happen. And the reason that biology has designed this system this way is because when that calf is born and he then goes to drink cow's milk is actually super low in copper. Actually, most mammals' milk is super low in copper. So he's born with quite high liver copper because he needs to depend on his own stores of copper for the first several weeks of life when he's only drinking milk that's very low in copper. But enter the dairy system, if we pull calves off of cows and we have them in a milk replacer system and hutches, etc., all of a sudden the biology starts to look a little different because instead of consuming milk that has very low copper, right, now we have fortified copper in the milk replacer. And we try to get that calf on a starter diet really quickly, right? Get his rumen up and going. That's all good stuff. But we put a bunch of copper in there. So this kind of 1-2 punch of having copper in the milk replacer, copper in the starter, he's already born with high liver copper, and bonus, he's actually a monogastric in this first several weeks of life, right? He doesn't have the typical antagonisms that we have in the rumen of a functional ruminant, where in the rumen, copper and molybdenum and sulfur would kind of hook up and make friends and keep the copper from being absorbed. This guy is just straight to the intestine, absorbs a bunch of this copper that we're feeding. So I think the reason they're coming into the feedlot so high in copper really traces back to this critical, what did he get in late gestation and what did he get in that first pre-weaning period?
Oh, and these calves were getting what we know on the dairy side that we need for them to be successful, right? But then when they then go on to enter the feedlot and they now have an excess above and beyond what they've already been started, and that's where we see these issues. And so let's really break out, what does copper toxicity look like and what are the detrimental effects that you end up seeing on your end?
Yeah, I think, one of our biggest challenges with copper nutrition or mineral nutrition in general is that there's no obvious sign. We can't just walk out and say, you know what, that calf looks copper deficient or he looks copper toxic, because often they are symptoms of something just like poor performance or maybe diarrhea or something that we might feel like, well, maybe it's just acidosis or something else, right? You wouldn't instantly think, boy, that diarrhea must be a problem with copper nutrition, right? So honestly, it's when somebody does a necropsy on an animal that has died and they start looking at things like liver minerals is the first time we get a snapshot to say, oh, okay, something is really out of bounds. And we had a great question today from somebody who was like, well, this must be a beef on dairy thing. Like we don't see these with our heifers that we keep. And I was like, I guarantee you that they're exactly the same. You're just not looking. And I think, is this one more thing that is contributing to poor, immune responses and other stressors that we get because that animal's not designed to just be loaded to the gills with copper for her whole life.
So, you talk about the liver abscesses, correct? And now that's a bigger issue when we get to the processing side. Is this that pathway to what could be leading to those liver abscesses that have for the last, several years? As a journalist in the industry, it's something that I've been, covering throughout my career in the last, I don't know, probably 5 or 7 years as well. Is that maybe where some of that is coming from that we end up seeing on the processing side?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think it's important to remember that liver abscesses are probably very multifactorial, right? So it's probably a combination of genetics of the animal. I'm not saying copper could definitely be a part of the story, right? Really, we haven't looked at that much. Feeding behavior being different in these animals based on the way that they were raised or some of the Holstein genetics in there versus our straight beef. Pen conditions. There's lots of different things that can contribute to that, which microbes are present in the rumen. But if we just think about it from a simply, if the liver is compromised, is it going to be more likely to have abscesses that get out of control? I think the answer is definitely yes. And we've definitely seen with high copper, the whole animal has inflammation going on. That all starts back at the liver. That is step one of where acute phase proteins get produced. So we know that it's like, you know what, instead of supporting growth, I'm going to have to support this inflammatory response instead.
Okay. So thank you for shining some light on that side of this picture. And I had you fast forward to the processing, the harvesting end, but I'm going to backtrack us to looking at this calf once more in the feedlot because you mentioned respiratory. So open up that topic, if you will, of this correlation between excessive copper levels and respiratory disease.
Yeah. So going back to kind of the original question that we started with here, right? Why are these beef on dairy calves not thriving when they come into the feedlot? Obviously, he didn't thrive if I'm looking at his necropsy results, right, in my email. So asking, why is this the case? And really, we decided to do that in a research study. So we had some work funded from the Iowa Beef Checkoff, where our state producers have an additional 50 cents per head checkoff that they pay in addition to the $1 standard. And that some of that goes to education and some of it goes to research. So we got a grant funded from that to basically say, let's look at how liver copper concentrations in these beef on dairy calves does or doesn't explain their response to disease. So we did 2 different studies, and both of these studies are published now. Jacob Henderson did this as a part of his graduate work. But basically, we looked to see, does liver copper affect vaccine response? And the short answer was no. That would have been too simple, right, to say that that was what the answer was. Then we did a more complex respiratory disease challenge where we basically gave these steers a virus and bacterial challenge to remake basically what bovine respiratory disease looks like. And in that case, what we saw is that the calves who had high liver copper, so we're talking 600, 700, 800 parts per million of liver copper, just like those ones I'm seeing in my inbox, right, from the different vets and everything, those animals have higher fever. They have greater, coughing and clinical scores. They have more lung consolidation. All of those things collectively mean that they don't handle disease as well, even to the point where it could actually be fatal.
How compelling was this for you when you started to see these trends?
Well, it was validating because when I first got that first email and I was like 800 parts per million of liver copper, and I'm like calling the diagnostic lab and being like, did you not adjust this for dry matter properly? Like, this must be wrong math somewhere, right? And they're like, no, and we see a lot of those. And you start to realize this is a problem out in the industry. And so one of the fun things, maybe circling back to where we started, about getting to speak in front of more dairy audiences now is I kind of get to stand on my soapbox and say, this is the problem that we're dealing with. And I will give tons of credit to the dairy industry. They have broadly decreased copper supplementation across all kinds of diets, right? So they're working on it. I think now we just need to ask more questions about what about this pre-weaned calf, right? Like he's absorbing all this copper, but we're giving it to him in the diet, maybe not really thinking about how he came in loaded with copper and what we're sending out to the feedlot at the end.
Well, and getting back to that big question of why aren't these beef and dairy calves thriving? We've touched on copper and its impacts on health and respiratory, and also what it looks like internally, that shows up in the liver. Is there anything else from your observations, your research, that you would add as a bullet point to that list to answer that question of why they aren't thriving?
Yeah, I think one of the things the vets have done a really good job in the last couple of years is addressing the fact that sometimes these calves might be a little bit too much of a pincushion. They're getting vaccines every 2 or 3 weeks, right? So people are working on pulling those protocols back so that they're not getting so much, right? They're just in a constant pro-inflammatory state because they're getting something new through a needle all the time. So we need to just kind of like reel that back a little bit, right? Let them just focus on being healthy and growing. So I think that's one thing, right? My good friend Jody McGill at the vet school at Iowa State, she's an immunologist, and she describes the dairy cow immune system as loud. And I think that that's a great way to describe it, right? It's just kind of this athlete who's just kind of all her inflammation is just kind of a little higher than normal. And I kind of think, this is my theory, when we took a beef animal and we crossed him with a dairy animal, we got a little bit of dairy under the hood in the sense that they got a loud immune system, but they're kind of beefy on the outside, so they try to hide it. Beef cows are really good at hiding when they're sick, exceptionally good at it. And I think that this is maybe one of the bad things about this particular cross is that they can be sick inside and you can't always tell on the outside.
Can you define that term loud? What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So when you get sick, you need to have an immune response, right? Your early immune response is cytokines that start to get produced and then acute phase proteins. And they're really important. You need to do it so that the disease that's challenging you doesn't win, doesn't get out of control. But what you don't want to have happen is have an overzealous immune response. And then you're spending all your time and energy and your nutrients making this big, overwhelmingly unnecessary immune response. Dairy cows have a higher, louder immune response than if we think about beef cattle.
That makes sense. Thank you for breaking that out. And as we, again, look at this topic, and I'm just thinking about the different levels at which dairy producers are involved with their beef on dairy calves. So we've got some that are going to sell a day old, right? We're going to have some that will retain some ownership, and maybe they send them off after weaning. We have others that are retaining ownership for a longer period of time, and some full through this to the supply chain point. So I'm going to challenge you, Stephanie. Can you just kind of break out the actionable steps that a producer could take at their level to be able to have an influence on what we're talking about today, and that's that higher level of copper toxicity that can cause some pretty major challenges. So let's start with the day olds. So if I'm sending my calves off at a day old, should I care?
Can we back up a stage and
Yes.
start before he's even born?
Yes.
Let's think about the late gestation cow, right? So the pre-fresh cow, and think about if we can have a better idea of what she's actually eating. Her copper supplementation strategies based on what the NRC recommends aren't too out of hand, but sometimes I think we don't always know what that cow's actually eating. So if she's eating a lot more copper, a lot of that's going to baby. And it may be copper that she likely doesn't need anyway. So is that a way to pull back copper a little bit in that phase? I would like us to start there. But okay, let's say we didn't do that. We have a day old. That's a segmented industry. It is so hard to get the person who is selling to the next one to care about what you're selling to the next one, right? Especially in a market like today when they are worth insane amounts of money as a 24-hour-old wet calf, right? But eventually our cow herd is going to rectify itself, right? And the producers who work now to become a good partner with the person that they're selling to are going to be able to demand a premium in the future when we come back to slightly more normal prices. So that to me would be part of it. The other one is there's still a likelihood that he just isn't even going to make it to the next destination, right? If they're stressed with all this liver copper. So there's still just a health challenge with that.
And then those that are retaining ownership, maybe up until that point of going through the feed yard. So they're holding on to ownership during a very important stage where that challenge has come in of entering the feed yard and maybe, experiencing some of those higher levels of copper.
Yeah. I think two things there. One, if it's possible to decrease copper in the starter, that's probably the easy one to do. So in the pre-weaning and post-weaning period, back down that copper that's in the starter. We don't probably need very much in there because he's got all that liver copper on board already. Maybe your milk replacer is commercial anyway, or you're feeding bull tank or whatever, like you don't have, or like waste milk, right? Like you don't have a lot of control over that. So maybe don't worry so much about that. Decrease what's in the starter. That's an easier place. Then the other one is when they do come into the feedlot, one of the things we commonly do in the feedlot industry, like we talked about, was fortify copper in the diet. So we feed 2 times the recommendation. Don't do that when they come in, right? You can feed just the recommendation and you don't need to necessarily feed more than that because unlike beef calves coming in, he's already got a lot of copper on board.
Well, hey, thank you for sharing those points. And this is your soapbox topic. So before we wrap up this conversation, Stephanie, is there anything else that you would like to add from your soapbox when we talk about beef on dairy calves and some of these opportunities to help them thrive instead of struggle?
Yeah, so a lot of what we talked about today was things that maybe there's some value in reducing in the diet, and that would be things like copper, but not in all minerals are the same. And some of our research, some in dairy beef, but also just in straight beef, would suggest that feeding a little more zinc than what the NRC might recommend can actually be beneficial. So we know zinc can be anti-inflammatory. And so maybe it can help be a little bit of a balancing act between this high copper, high zinc kind of thing. So I think it's not all bad on the mineral side, right? There can be some benefits, and think about ways to have minerals and vitamins help this animal be back on track.
Well, excellent. And so I think part of our closing message here is stay tuned for more information and more research that's really geared toward understanding beef on dairy calves. And it sounds like you're the person to address those conversations.
I appreciate that.
And before I let you go, Stephanie, I know that you spend your days doing research and looking at facts, but you have a love for fiction, and not just reading fiction, but actually writing it. And just an interesting point that I picked up about you today, you got to talk about this for just a minute here. You're an author.
I am. I actually published my first novel during the pandemic. So, had all that extra time where I didn't have a commute to work and back. So I was like, this is the time to finish this project. And so published my first book. And I'm a huge travel bug. And so I go to national parks quite a bit. So all of my books, they're crime thrillers, and they are set in national parks. So my very first book was set in Yellowstone. And my current series, she's an FBI agent, and she's the liaison with the national parks and works with a park ranger partner, and they solve crimes in national parks.
Okay, so the book you're working on right now comes out when?
Yes, so the book I'm working on right now is the 4th in my Harper and Reese thriller series that takes place in national parks, and this one comes out in April of 2026.
And is it by Stephanie Hansen, or do you have a writer's alias?
Yes, this is a funny story. So in my genius, when I was like, I should not publish under Stephanie L. Hansen, I should do SL Hansen, except for that's what we use in most of academia. So my pen name is SL Hansen.
Well, wonderful. Well, I'll tell you what, we'll make sure we include links for you, for producers to know that you are a point of contact for their challenges with beef on dairy calves, but also for those that might have little bug themselves for some national park thriller reading, to be able to check out the newest book in your series. So what a pleasure to sit down with you today, Stephanie.
Thank you so much. It was great.
All right. Thank you. You just heard from Dr. Stephanie Hansen of Iowa State University. Her insights remind us that what we feed and when can shape the long-term success of beef on dairy calves. Thanks for listening to the Uplevel Dairy Podcast. I'm your host, Peggy Coffeen. Don't forget to follow, rate, and share wherever you get your podcasts. And until next time, keep on growing, keep on learning, and up-leveling your dairy. This episode is sponsored by Uplevel Dairy Podcast founding partner Adisseo, a global leader in nutritional solutions and premier provider of rumen-protected methionine for dairy producers who want to optimize milk production, capture more value from components, and maintain the health of their high-performing herds. Feed is the greatest expense on any dairy operation, and don't you want to know how an adjustment to the ration will affect your bottom line? Adisseo empowers nutritionists to make informed ration balancing decisions with MilkPay.com. Customizable to your dairy's own data, this profitability calculator puts the power of real-time milk market information in the palm of your hand. Find out how much your latest ration change is really costing you with the free MilkPay app available on iOS and through MilkPay.com.